there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Glasgow is a city divided, cut in half by one lethal weapon, the blade.
Knife crimes and razor gangs have been a presence on the streets of Glasgow for nearly 200 years.
There are more scarred faces in Glasgow than anywhere else in Britain. In 2002, the World Health Organization declared Scotland as one of the bloodiest nations in the Western world, and Glasgow the murder capital of Europe.
The roots of this violence lie in Glasgow's back streets and becomes most volatile when the city's two football clubs, Celtic and Rangers, clash. A brutal razor attack in the 1920s shines light on this rivalry, which runs far deeper than football.
Almost 80 years later in 2010, another victim is cut down, this time butchered with a sword after an argument escalates out of control.
We're going to look at two savage attacks which typify the city's street violence, and we'll investigate the cause and effect of the split that still divides Glasgow to this day. In the 1920s, Glasgow was the most overcrowded city in Britain, with more street gangs than anywhere else. There were 6 times more gangs in Glasgow than even London. It was also one of Britain's poorest cities.
Glasgow became the corpse of an industrial city, devoid of the spirit of industry. And in the poorest areas, the razor gangs prospered, and the city's hard man mentality became firmly entrenched.
To find out what effect this mindset had upon the city, I'm going to meet historian Douglas Skelton.
What's the history of the gang culture here? And when did it start?
Ever since they started building what would become the slums, the gangs would have formed. There were gangs that would come out of the slum areas, go to the centre of Glasgow and attack the travellers there. They would create a distraction and steal their luggage and pick their pockets. They would fight with each other. The earliest known gang is the penny mob from the 19th century. And they were called that because they paid a penny into a levy to help pay for fines. Coming into the 20th century, you started to see more gangs being formed with various colourful names, like the Redskins.
It's like pop bands, aren't they?
Well, they are, yes, except they got their name because their faces were slashed and took on a red hue, and they were very proud of this.
But now, the violence in Glasgow was about to get much worse. Into this deprived and competitive city came immigrants from Ireland. In the late 1800s, fleeing the second wave of the potato famine, they searched for work on Clydeside. They formed large Catholic neighbourhoods within the Protestant city. This new influx added unwelcome competition, creating resentment, hatred, and violence.
It would go back to the Irish potato famine. Now, that was the beginning of the sectarian strife in Glasgow because it was a Protestant city, as Scotland was a Protestant country, if you like, up until then. And a lot of these Catholics were coming in, and they just were viewed as less than human. Very, very unfairly, because they were just coming over trying to survive.
Right.
They were seen as incomers who were going to steal their jobs, going to steal their way of life. And it wasn't true, because in a lot of cases they wouldn't get jobs because they were Catholic. So they started to cluster to themselves, as you would. They were looking for safety in numbers.
These are some of the areas where the Irish settled. Gorbals in the south, Carlton in the east, and Gangland, now Royston, just north of the Clyde. And these were Protestant areas, many of them in the west. One area which became a flashpoint bordering Catholic districts was called Bridgeton, or Brigton. And this was home to an infamous Protestant gang, the Brigton Boys, soon to be known as the Billy Boys. They took their name from William of Orange, the Dutch-born king who in the 17th century annexed Northern Ireland and installed the Protestant church. The Billy Boys were devotees of King Billy.
Legend has it that the gang was formed in 1924 by a man who came from this street. His name was William Fullerton.
Apparently, when he was 18, he made the mistake of scoring a goal against the opposition, the Kent Star, a Catholic gang from Carlton. After the game, he was attacked by a Kent Star player wielding a hammer. He vowed to take revenge and formed a gang of 30 men.
Billy Fullerton, who formed them, according to the story, was beaten up by a gang of Catholics when he was in his late teens, and he decided that he would form his own gangs to basically anything they could do, he could do bloodier.
And here are the Brigton, or Billy Boys, dressed in their marching regalia. And right here in the centre, with the big bass drum, that's their leader, Billy Fullerton himself. I'm heading now to the centre of Billy Boy territory, known as the Toll, Brigton Cross, where the Billy Boys would all converge. This was their headquarters. They controlled this patch. Being Protestant, the Billy Boys saw themselves as patriotic defenders of the nation. Like mercenaries, they even loaned their services out to right-wing political movements. To learn more, I'm meeting up with historian Andrew Davis.
Now, I understand that the Billy Boys were employed politically as well by some of the local politicians.
That's right. There are reports of the Billy Boys disrupting left-wing meetings in Glasgow so that meetings of the Communist Party, for example, were vulnerable to being attacked.
So unlike other gangs which very much stand outside of the law, the Billy Boys saw themselves as upholding the moral high ground.
They did, and they very much saw themselves as defending not just their fellow Protestants in East End, but defending the Constitution.
The Protestant Billy Boys could be called upon for a show of muscle to repel any opposition. They were organised and dressed like an army.
This was a gang that almost saw themselves in a sort of military way, didn't they? They were quite well-disciplined, drilled. You paid money to be in this gang. What sort of things, how did they present themselves in that way?
Well, the gang was organised into sections with around 40 members, and apparently each section had its own leader, and that leader was then answerable, as it were, to the senior ranks of the gang, with Fullerton very much at the helm. So the gang's members paid subscription fees as part of their membership, and that money would be used to pay the members' fines when they were taken to court, but also to provide things like boots and clothing for members of the gang when they were released from jail.
So they would see themselves as being part of the establishment because the establishment was Protestant.
Because they came with flags and they came with song and they came with all those things that make up a regular army.
What had happened there was that when the Irish came over, it wasn't just Irish Catholics that came over, it was Irish Protestants as well. The Orange Walk was marched, or still is marched, to commemorate the Battle of the Boyne in July. And Billy Fullerton was quick to recognise that this was another strand that he could do for his Billy Boys. So he set up a flute band, and that's where they had the uniforms and the songs and the instruments.
My story from 2010 is about the Curran and the Malavin families. Zach Malavin, Andrew Curran. Two families supposedly attached to the same Mary Hill Fleet gang. This is Mary Hill, where they hang out in the northwest of the city. But they're not alone. There's over 100 other gangs in this part of Glasgow, all in deprived areas where unemployment and drug use is high. I'm meeting up with journalist Stephen Wilkie, who has first-hand experience of the gangs in this neighbourhood.
There is no one gang for all of Mary Hill. Mary Hill's a huge area, but within that patch you'll have individual streets where you get 10, 15, 20 little guys. They've got their own gang, named after the street usually, not like the English postcode gangs, and they're not organised in any way. There's no actual formal leader. It's just whoever's biggest and toughest on the day, or whoever's got the money to buy the carry-out that day, is the one that says what they do.
How long's it been going then?
Since the city was here. Since the city was here, there's always been somebody willing to tax their neighbour. Somebody willing to say, I run this street, or I run this building, or I run this high-rise. It's just people saying, this is my patch. Come into it at your peril. I'll come into your patch and I expect to get attacked, but I'll drag you back to my patch and my mob will kill you. Yeah, and it's kind of cavemanish.
Once the violence was sectarian, but now it's mostly about drug turf, or in this case, plain old pride. The slightest slur upon another family can result in a bloodbath. This story is about the fallout between the Curran and the Malavin families. It was ignited by a juvenile joke.
One of the Malavins, or one of their associates, was very upset because somebody had nicked a bottle he had of booze, Buckfast vodka, one of these cheap drinks, and urinated into it, and he took a swallow and spat it out, and it came from literally a stupid little insult, or a prank, teenage prank, which is what you'd have called it, and ends up a guy dead.
It was a friend of Andrew Curran's called Paul Brown who had urinated into Zach Malavin's drink. Malavin would soon retaliate. Now, as you can imagine, Zach Malavin wasn't very happy about this, so in reply, he stabbed Brown and Curran. Then later tried to run Curran down in his car. To prevent this turning into an ongoing feud, Curran's father, also called Andrew, arranged a meeting with the Malavins in Maryhill Park to sort things out.
His father, who's of an age who will know you don't mess with a big family like the Malavins, picked up the phone, made an approach and said, get the boys down to the park, we'll sort this out. We're not talking about what we call in Glasgow a square go, which is a no-weapons fight. Yeah. We weren't talking about that, they're talking about sitting down and just getting it sorted.
So why did they choose this then?
Because there's no CCTV. So you can sit in here at night, you can drink your drink, you can smoke your dope, you can party with your pals, have your music on, and nobody's really going to interfere with you. Yeah. And whatever you get up to, it's not on tape.
Both families agreed to meet here, Maryhill Park, on the evening of April the 16th. It culminated in a bloody and barbaric slaying that shocked the whole community.
In the 1930s, the rivalry between the Protestant and Catholic was played out on the football pitch, with the west of the town supporting Rangers and the east supporting Celtic.
In spite of the weather, we saw Celtic trying their skill against the Rangers. Celtic kicked off and run straight into the attack.
The Billy Boys use their loyalty to Rangers as a way of attacking Catholics.
Real trouble breaking out on the terraces here.
They would infiltrate the Rangers fans to provoke battles with Celtic supporters.
Referee has stopped the match, as he would have to do, of course.
One of their many fights took place here, on a train.
On the afternoon of the 3rd of March 1934, a group of about 500 Rangers supporters were gathered here at Bridgeton Station on their way to a match at Ibrox.
Andrew is taking me to the exact spot where they had all amassed. It's now a disused platform beneath the new station.
Oh yeah, rather you than me.
This was the site of one of the Billy Boys' attacks, which would ultimately seal their fate.
Oh, I see.
It has become a shrine to the gang.
So we're walking now into what was part of the original Bridgeton Cross station, and you just look at the The walls here, some of the kind of the legends told in the graffiti are taking you right back to the 1920s. The Derry Boys was basically the junior section of the Billy Boys.
Oh,
so
right.
a young lad would join the Derry Boys first and then would be promoted, as he's probably in his late teens, promoted into the senior ranks of the Billy Boys.
So this is part of the original station where the famous attack happened?
That's right. The platform is packed with Rangers supporters, as many as 500 or 600 of them decked out in blue scarves and rosettes. They're waiting for a train that's going to take them to Ibrox Park. Rangers are playing at home. But onto the platform arrives a train heading to Paisley that's carrying Celtic supporters to St Mirren. And as soon as the train grinds to a halt, the two sets of supporters begin hurling abuse at each other. There are all kinds of insults and threats being shouted. So the Rangers supporters are hurling abuse at the papists, as they call them, on the train. That abuse is given back in spades by the Celtic supporters. And then in the middle of this pandemonium on the platform, a group of Rangers supporters steps forward.
What followed was sectarian violence, but it was hidden amongst a football crowd and would pass off as an act of hooliganism. It started when one of the Billy Boys, a man called John Traitor, burst onto the train. It would typify football thuggery for decades to come. It would also bring about a war on gangs and the downfall of the Billy Boys. Traitor set upon the first man he could find, a man called McVeigh, and Traitor tried to slash him across the face with a razor. But McVeigh shielded himself with his arm. Traitor then turned around and punched McVeigh's companion in the face.
The other passengers are desperate to get him off. The guard comes running down the train and helps to bundle Traitor back off onto the platform, and then he's screaming at the driver to get the train out of there as quickly as possible.
Here are some of the weapons the Billy Boys used to carry. Knives, hatchets, hammers. And this is a razor, like the one used by Traitor in the attack.
It wasn't just a regular group of Rangers fans.
It wasn't. Traitor was very much associated with the Billy Boys. He had quite a record of taking part in sectarian gang fights in the East End. And what seems to have happened here is that a group of Billy Boys has planned this ambush, and they've used the much bigger group of Rangers supporters on the platform as a kind of cover or a cloak for their activity.
My story from 2010 is about the Maryhill Park. The Curran and the Malavin families arranged to meet and settle a dispute. Andrew Curran had initiated the meeting after an altercation involving a member of the Malavin family. So the Malavins and the Currans arranged to meet here.
Yep.
Just tell me what happened.
Andrew Curran and his pals turned up, in theory expecting to sort out a problem which was beginning to get out of hand. Might not all walk away friends, but we'll all walk away for it, they thought. But the Malavins were never intending to do that, because they turned up with the shotgun, the knives, the machetes, etc. And young Curran turns up with his pals.
The Malavins also brought backup. The two sides clashed. Andrew Curran Sr. was called on his mobile and, unarmed, ran to the park with his friend James McGregor to help. He tries to calm the situation, but the Malavins turn on him. They chase him across the park with a machete.
Talking about a man in his 40s, perhaps not his fittest, getting chased across the park by presumably a mad, full of drugs or drink kid waving a 3-foot machete at you.
Andrew Curran Sr. was cornered and slashed in the stomach and the neck. His son could only watch as his father clutched his throat as blood just poured from it.
And he's been pretty brutally dispatched.
He was attacked with a machete?
Machete, yeah, which is jungle stuff. It's horror book stuff.
Then Andrew Curran's friend, James McGregor, aged 50, was chased and assaulted. He was slashed with a sword and shot in the body with a crossbow.
To me, it looked like the whole scenario was hijacked so that somebody could do something nasty to somebody. And the premise for it all was this: there's been a slight, there's been an insult, you've taken it too far, whatever, with this bottle of pee.
So you think the two families had a problem before?
I think the Malavins had a problem with young Curran. Once you turn up in a park, one with a shotgun, one with a machete, 2 or 3 with knives, you're not there for any reason other than to inflict serious damage.
An ambulance was called. Andrew went with his father to hospital. He died the same day. Andrew Curran Sr. was unarmed, yet he was mercilessly stabbed to death in Maryhill Park. He was attacked with a machete after he'd gone to help his son calm a feud with the Malavin family.
It's believed Mr. Curran's 18-year-old son was in this area on Saturday night. He got into bother with the gang, and his father, who lived just down the road, ran out to help him. It's believed the gang then turned on him and stabbed him.
He was a brave boy to turn up, and his dad did what any father would. You would do, I would do. Kids, someone threatens your child, you're straight in there. Yeah. We wouldn't pick up a weapon, we'd pick up the phone and dial the police. Yeah. But in this sort of area or in this sort of situation, you don't have time to pick up the police. You cause more danger for your child if you do pick up the police, because you're a grass, your kids are grass, your whole family's marked by everybody at that point. So you do what you do. You go out the house and you try and calm it down.
In this tight-knit neighbourhood, no incident goes unnoticed.
Calls are made to the police. Police know exactly who's done it. The whole area knew who'd done it. I was at home within 2 phone calls, knew who'd done it. But it's getting the process of getting them into court, getting people to give evidence, getting witnesses assured that they will be safe. When the witness has got to live in the heartland, next door to some of these people, or in the same close, as we call it, the same tenement as their relatives. They've got to go to the same shops, go to the same chemists, pick up methadone from the same chemists, etc. You know, that's the way it is up here.
But despite the intimidation, the perpetrators were charged and taken to court. The Malavin brothers, Angus, aged 26, and Zach, just 17, along with a man named Stephen Sooley, aged 21, were brought to trial at the High Court in Glasgow. Brothers Zach and Angus were found guilty of the murder of 41-year-old Andrew Curran. Zach Malavin got 18 years, his brother, 17. Sooley was found guilty of culpable homicide and received 7 years. All 3 men were also convicted of assaulting Mr. Curran's friend, James McGregor, by slashing him with a sword and shooting him with a crossbow, causing permanent disfigurement. But when the court was over, the violence began.
I mean, within hours of the trial finishing, there was intimidation, people were giving evidence. I mean, 4 hours after the guys were sent down, the brothers were sent down, there was a shotgun through a window. There was a guy got slashed in Maryhill Road, there's somebody else got threatened in their car. And that's before the family were even back from court. These people were genuinely innocent witnesses, in most cases, who got dragged into something they'd never experienced, and then suddenly found themselves getting forced to uphold sort of gangland scruples and morals, if you can call them that, where you don't speak, you don't deal, you don't get... You've seen a guy stabbed to death, or a neighbour you've known for 20 or 30 years gets murdered, and you know who's done it, and you're a decent person. You're going to speak up. But the idea that someone's going to come up 5 o'clock in the morning, some total coward, and put a double-barrel shotgun in the fire, 150 shells, 150 ball bearings through your window, your kids are sleeping, your grandkids are sleeping.
Yeah, of course.
And you don't know when you walk out the door the next morning if they're waiting there. I wouldn't do it.
Further violence against the Curran family was soon to come.
This is Rothers Drive in Somerston. Just 1 month after the Malavin brothers were jailed, the victim's son, Andrew Curran, was attacked right here. He was stabbed several times in the head with a machete. just yards away from where his father was killed. I wondered just how often attacks like this happen in Glasgow. In a single year, 2008-2009, assaults with a sharp object in the Glasgow region resulted in over 2,000 occupied bed days in hospital. That's 6 beds all year long, containing the victims of blade attacks. I've never come across anything like this before. This clan-like culture is so aggressive and violent. It's just totally alien. To try and grasp an understanding of it, I'm on my way to the Southern General Hospital to meet surgeon Dr. Christine Goodall. Christine.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Martin.
Hi, Martin.
So you're an oral surgeon?
Yeah, that's right.
Just explain to me what that is.
Well, you would understand an oral surgeon probably as the person who takes out your wisdom teeth and does things like that. So a lot of what we do is dental, but we also deal with facial trauma, usually as a result of violence, usually young men actually. And we have to deal with injuries that range from anything from just bruising from fist fights right up to very, very serious injuries that have been caused when people start using weapons.
What sort of injuries do you see with someone coming in here with a razor cut?
Well, what you would typically see is a big scar across the face, and oftentimes what people do is they'll slash somebody like that. So that's what you tend to get. That's not a good place to have a facial scar.
Why?
The easiest ones to repair are the ones that fit into the lines that everybody has on their face. So into those kind of sort of smile lines. If you have one right across your face, then that's always going to be quite obvious. And that's typically what you see from these injuries. The worst sort of those are the ones where maybe 2 razor blades or 2 Stanley blades have been stuck together on the back of a toothbrush, leaving a small gap in between. And that gives you a very difficult scar to repair because you have to take out the piece of tissue in the middle.
And then you have to pull it all together.
You have to put it all together, and you're left with a deficit of tissue then. And
why is that? Just explain to me. Why can't you sew both
because
the lines?
It won't have enough of a blood supply to survive. Right. So the bit in the middle, it would tend to die and fall away, and that would leave you with a bigger problem. So you're better to cut that bit out and stitch together what you've got. But it unfortunately leaves you quite a wide scar. And that's very difficult to hide later on.
Do you ever see someone coming in here with the Glasgow Smile?
You occasionally do see it. More times than not, it would be one side and not both sides. The typical Glasgow Smile is cut on both sides. Yeah. And that's very much a gang thing where somebody's been pinned down and that's been done to them. But oftentimes you would just maybe see one side and not the other, and it's a cut from the side of the mouth right up. And again, a very difficult wound to repair well.
Do you ever get someone coming in here who is kind of proud of their scars?
Yeah, we do. We do.
That must be so disheartening.
It is. I had a young lad quite a few years ago now who I saw in the middle of the night stitched up, and we kept him overnight in the hospital because he'd been drinking. And I went round to see him the next morning, and I said to him, look, I'm really sorry about this. It's a really bad injury. You're going to be left with a scar. You know, we can maybe in the fullness of time try and make it a bit less obvious, but it's never going to not be there. And he just said to me, oh, don't worry about it, Hen. It's not a problem. And I thought, all right, okay, that's a bit strange. And then all of his friends came to visit him in the afternoon, and they all had scars. Yeah. And actually for him, that was his badge of honour.
Gangs wear scars like badges. They're like marks of honour. There seems something so viciously self-hating in the urge to destroy another person's appearance. Why have they got to slash someone's face?
The booze and blades culture.
You know, why can't they just punch someone?
Well, so one of them, I spoke to one about 20 years ago, and he said it's like the old, you know, have a duel, leave the man with a duelling scar thing. And I said, you see it? He said, well, that's what it was like. It's just like Zorro time and like the Austrian sword fencing. So you leave a guy with a mark, so everyone knows I've tanned him. So next time you see him in the street, I've claimed you. And the guy's got a smile on his face. The Glasgow Smile, which is the classic, up the sides.
I'm looking at a Glasgow gang called the Billy Boys, one of the largest and most organised gangs in the city's history.
After John Traitor attacked a Celtic supporter on a train, the police started a manhunt. At 10:30 p.m, a man is charged with drunk and incapable behaviour and is taken into custody.
It took them 2 days to identify the man. Presumably once he'd sobered up,
They finally ID'd him as John Traitor, the man who so brutally attacked John McVeigh on the train. He was charged with mobbing, assault and rioting. The trial of John Traitor would be a turning point and came as a surprise to everyone. At that time, the law had been heavily biased towards Protestants. They had often been treated leniently, but this time the judge showed no favours.
And Traitor was found guilty.
John Traitor then gets a really exemplary sentence. The judge sentences him to 4 years imprisonment.
How was that seen? Was that harsh?
It was really quite harsh, given the offence for which he'd been convicted, and there was quite a lot of uproar. There's a petition launched in protest against the severity of the sentence, and something around 40,000 people signed that, asking for a review of the sentence, that really, protesting that jail term was far too long.
And was it changed?
It wasn't. The appeal went to the Secretary of State for Scotland, but he turned it down.
John Traitor may only have committed an assault, but it was what he represented that so frightened the authorities. Hundreds of fighting football fans could potentially be whipped up and used by the likes of Traitor and the Billy Boys for political means. To the authorities, the consequences were unthinkable. Destabilising hundreds of football supporters could transform gang violence into full sectarian war. Viewed in isolation, this one incident, a random act of violence, may appear insignificant against the backdrop of Glasgow's history. But what terrified the authorities was the thought of what this scale of infiltration could become, and the sectarian violence it could unleash. In line with this tougher stance, Glasgow's new chief of police was none other than Gangbuster Percy Sillitoe.
He had done such wonderful work down in Sheffield, according to the stories. So they brought him up here over and above a local man. That caused some aggro locally, and he immediately set out on his own boot and baton policy to bring them into line.
Scores of big, hardy men were recruited from the Highlands and other rural areas, given basic training, a uniform, and told to get out and mix it.
Arrest and fine wasn't doing any good, so they were going to batter their way out of it. So basically fight fire with fire.
The 1,500-strong Glasgow police were the largest force in Britain outside London. They were called the biggest gang in the world, and the Billy Boys had now become their prime target. During the 1930s, the Billy Boys remained the most powerful gang in Glasgow. Marching behind their leader, Billy Fullerton, they set out to taunt the Catholic neighbourhoods.
The Billy Boys came marching down this street, Norman Street, inflaming the Catholic locals with their music.
A large Catholic razor gang, known as the Norman Conks, who lived in this street, often prepared to retaliate when they heard the Billy Boys approaching.
The Norman Conks knew they were coming, heard they were coming because they weren't creeping up on them, and would ambush them. So from the windows, from roofs, if they could get onto them, they would attack them, throw missiles, throw bottles, throw dirt, anything at all, human waste. And then down in the street, there would be a battle royal going on.
But by 1935, the Glasgow police, now under the command of Gangbuster Percy Sillitoe, set out to ambush the gangs.
Police mounted a charge led by Sillitoe's Cossacks, as his force were known. It was the beginning of the end for the Billy Boys.
Sillitoe ordered the mounted police to Celtic Park, together with 2 large covered vans filled with policemen. They hid down a side street. There they waited.
But they were clever with it. They didn't wade in at the height of battle. They waited until both sides had more or less worn each other out, and then the police would come in and mop it up in a far more ferocious way on occasion.
As the Billy Boys band entered Norman Street, the order to charge was given.
This row here became littered with casualties. The police had broken up the parade, scoring an historic victory. According to Sillitoe, only one of the Billy Boys escaped without injury. It was Elijah Cooper, the big drum player, who hid in his drum until he could surrender peacefully.
But that wasn't necessarily what broke the gangs in the end. It was his intelligence gathering techniques, it was other things that he did. It wasn't just the violence, it wasn't the untouchables, it wasn't the Silitos Cossacks, as the Mounties became to be called. Right. It was the whole package. He brought in all sorts of revolutionary new ideas to the Glasgow police force. Everything came together and helped bring the gangs down. Didn't destroy them, didn't wipe them out, but it certainly brought them down a peg or two.
Billy Fullerton was sent to prison, and while he was inside, Silito was able to inflict the most damage by seizing the Billy Boys' bank account. There he found £600 stashed away to pay the gang's court and legal expenses. It would spell the end of the Billy Boys, but Fullerton's extreme prejudices would soon find new outlets. When he came out, Billy Fullerton created a 200-strong band of Mosley's Black Shirts until the fascist leader was interned. Later, Fullerton formed Glasgow's own branch of the Ku Klux Klan. As well as despising people of colour, the KKK was also anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic. Billy Fullerton died in poverty in 1962, aged 57, in a single-room tenement home in Brook Street, just to the north of Brigton Cross. He was given a spectacular send-off, including flute bands, as around 1,000 marched in his funeral cortege from Brigton Cross to the cemetery at Ridley in the northeast of Glasgow. There he is buried in an unmarked grave.
So where do we go from here? Where's the Percy Silito of the 21st century? Well, let me tell you, it's right here. Strathclyde's Violence Reduction Unit. I'm about to meet Karen McCluskey. She's a director of this unit, which she set up in 2008. She's responsible for bringing about a radical new approach in tackling gangs. She did what no one had ever dared do before. She hauled in all the gangs and laid down the law to them.
We wanted to try and make a big change because you can't just take 10 people. It has to be about hundreds to achieve a real big shift in gangs.
So how'd you do that?
We had to get the parents, we had to get the schools, we had to convince them to come in. And we had the most fantastic sheriffs down in the court. And they pretty much let us have the court. And we had a sitting sheriff. And we got all the guys in, and we had 120 in the morning and then another 100 in the afternoon. And the chief would stand up.
So you were putting rival gangs in the same way?
All of them. I mean, this was about, you know, it's a really risky strategy. I mean, I think when we started, I thought it'd be catastrophic or it'd be really successful. You know, these guys having weapons, we had to search them at the front door, we had a whole range of things in place. And we got them in the courtroom, and the chief stood up, and we flashed their pictures around the room. And we said, we know who you are, we know where you live. And he said, I'm so powerful, I can have them all outside your front door if I so wish, my corpse. You know, I can make your life really difficult. It's not hard, you know, but we want you to stop. We want you to stop this because I don't want to go and see your parents and tell them that you're dead or they're coming to arrest you for a murder.
So you came down hard on them. This is a soft approach.
The chief was, this is about hard enforcement, it's about the community, and it's also about, it's about making a promise, make a choice. And then we get a sergeant to stand up and he says, you boys might not know what you're doing, but let me tell you what I get in my surgery. And he shows them the pictures. And some of them are really graphic, but that's what he says, you know. I mean, we have some of the worst cases of facial injury anywhere in the world here. And you can see it, and they're looking away, you know. So they've gone from that chest out, you know, and come ahead to they're looking away. They cannot look at it. And we have had a few fainters. And then I suppose the best and the worst part is we get a mum to stand up. And it is just, unless you'd seen it, it's very difficult to explain. But she stands up and she says, you boys might not care about yourself, but here's what happened to my son when I cradled him when he died. And I go into his room every single day and I will never get over it. It's destroyed my husband, it's destroyed my family, and I cared about my son. And you know, and you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom.
I know exactly
and you
where
can hear them.
from.
You can hear them sobbing in the back, because regardless of how beleaguered some of these families are, they love their mothers.
Yeah.
And it's the most powerful thing ever. And we then say, make a choice. You can make a choice here. And the really interesting thing is, for lots of the people that we deal with, they've got no choice about where they're born, what parents they're born to, what school they go to, even what gang they go into. This sometimes is the first time in their life that they've had a choice. And it is amazing how many of them stand up in the court and say, I want out.
Everything I've seen and learnt in this city is like no place I've ever experienced before. No matter what the area, there are gangs. But it's not just the gangs. Here it's a whole deep-rooted mentality that goes with it. You have to admire the work that Karen is doing, but I wonder if it can ever eradicate the hatred, the bitterness, the violence, which has become so ingrained here, it's like a life force of its own. So what's the future hold for Glasgow's gangs?
Well, I think we're turning the corner. I mean, what we realise now is young people live in the OK and hello culture. They want to look good.
Yeah.
They want to, they're conscious about their appearance. If you get a scar on your face, you'll not get the job you want, you'll not get the, you're not get the girlfriend you want, it will affect you for the rest of your life. And I think sometimes with the medics going in, I think the kids are starting to see it, They talk about alcohol, they talk about the sugar concentration in alcohol and say to the girls, look, you put on loads of weight, it's no good in lycra, and, but these are the things that motivate people to change their behaviour, and that's what we want. We want them to step away from doing the violence, and to be brave enough and to have enough resilience to say, I don't want to be part of the gang.
So what are the results?
Well, we've had a 50% reduction in our offending, our our violence. So, I think it's probably exciting times, but it's resilience you need. This is a long term. It's been here for 100 years.
Yeah.
120 years. So you need to be pretty exceptional to try and drive it out.
I tell you, I'm shocked at what I've just seen in there. Karen off camera showed us some CCTV footage of some gang violence, but real gang violence. It kind of hit home what this show's all about. It was just sickening to see kids acting like that. And it's places like this that are working towards kind of fixing the problem. I'm still not convinced that it's a problem that can be fixed. I think it goes a lot deeper down than just the one gang, trying to take knives away. Or I think it's ingrained, the problem. Listen, we can only hope. With a straightforward murder inquiry costing 1.3 million and a year in prison working out at £49,000, this unit doesn't have to prevent many killings to become worthwhile. Since 2008, nearly 500 gang members from eastern Glasgow have engaged in the violence reduction scheme. As a result, violent offending has fallen by 46%, weapon possession has dropped by 85%, and involvement in gang fighting down by 73%. Glasgow is no longer the murder capital of Western Europe. In 2008, an illicit message sent from inside a British prison orders the murder of a teenager in Sheffield. A supposed traitor becomes a marked man.
Same city, the year 1925, 83 years earlier, and a brutal beating leaves a man dead. It's the first gangland murder Sheffield has ever seen. It sends a shockwave through the city, earning it the title of Little Chicago.
We'll be looking at two murders, both shocking, both caused by violent gang feuds.
We'll see how a giant gambling empire split to create Sheffield's gangland.
And how that continues to this day, played out with guns in backstreet turf wars.
We'll be finding out what triggers such violence and the measures the police have taken to break the cycle of crime.
Sheffield may not be the first city that comes to mind when you think of gang crime, but like many parts of the UK, the city has a history of gangs stretching back generations. At the time of the First World War, gangs in Sheffield didn't make their money from drugs or protection rackets, but from this, the game of pitch and toss. You place 3 coins on the ends of your fingers and then toss them. Tails, tails, heads. Believe it or not, betting on this became big business for the gangs of Sheffield, beginning a turf war which continues today. But what allowed a simple game of chance to take such a firm hold of the city?
The slums of Sheffield in the 1920s were some of the worst in Great Britain. Even the writer George Orwell said, this was the ugliest town in the world.
15,000 overcrowded back-to-back houses with poor shared sanitation made the city a hellhole. To the working classes without jobs, without prospects, and with very little money, there was just one pastime which provided a dim ray of hope: pitch and toss. It was illegal and controlled by gangs.
Well, I've come up here to meet J.P. Bean, who's the sort of local historian, social historian, has written a book about Sheffield gang wars. And I think he's going to tell me a lot about how the early gangs began here in Sheffield, grew out of poverty. And especially a man called George Mooney. JP.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, good to meet you. Good to meet
you too. How are you doing?
Good. So, where is it?
Up here. We're on Manor Lane Road.
Wonderful. Great graffiti.
Original Sheffield art.
JP is taking me up to the top of one of the hills overlooking the city. Today it looks more like a golf course or a playing field, but back then it was here that illegal betting took place.
This is Sky Edge, an ideal place for pitch and toss, which one of the most simple forms of gambling, but here vast sums were bet. A man called Jack White, who was a publican from Barnsley, was known to regularly bet £50 on one single toss of the coin.
Huge sum of money.
Huge sum of money. The organisers of the ring took 4 shillings in the pound as a toll. The toller ran the ring. George Mooney here was the toller. So somebody put £1 on, the pound went on the floor as the bet, 4 shillings went in George Mooney's pocket.
George Mooney became the leader of a highly profitable organisation. But all gambling outside of horse racing was illegal. Sky Edge was the perfect place.
Because it was high, they could have lookouts all the way round to warn of impending visits by the police.
I see.
They were known as pikers. Piking is a local term for looking. First sign of the police, the whistle would go up, they'd be away.
So how many men from the city would be up here, do you think, at one time?
200, 300. In the First World War, it was very, very popular.
So there was only one man tossing the coins?
The man tossing the coins was known as the tosser. Mooney was the toller, and the ponter, who was armed with a stick, kept order around the ring.
So it's very theatrical. One guy standing here, hundreds of people surrounding him, he's tossing the coins, people are shouting loudly.
Absolutely.
And people are over there looking out for the police.
And making side bets, as well as shouting loudly, on the outskirts, on the edge there, and all around.
And because Sky Edge was such a good vantage point, Mooney's men rarely got caught. And even if they did, the highest fine was only 40 shillings, when it was possible to make £40 in a day. Mooney's empire was making a fortune from miners and steel workers. But when the First World War ended, steel production ceased. Mooney's takings dropped dramatically. George Mooney wanted to keep hold of as much money as he could, so he slimmed down his operation. He got rid of all the scouts and minders, including his top henchman, Sam Garvin. This was a move that would have serious consequences.
That all rebounded upon him because Sam Garvin, who organised the park men, the men from the Park District of Sheffield, And they became rivals of the West Bar people led by Mooney.
And what was that gang called?
The Park Brigade. They were known as the Park Brigade, and they fought back for the right to run the tossing ring, and thus began the Sheffield gang wars in April 1923.
The feuds between the Moonies and the Park Brigade would push gang warfare in Sheffield to a new level of violence, earning the city the name of Little Chicago. It became the forerunner of the turf wars, which threaten the city today.
Same city nearly 100 years on, and another gang splits up, creating two opposing and violent groups locked in a bloody vendetta. The gang is called the S3, named after the postcode of the area where they live. The S3 was already a violent gang. It had an ongoing feud with the S4 gang, which led to 3 murders in 18 months. A police dossier chronicled at least 40 occasions in which the two gangs opened fire on each other. But now, a violent rift started within the S3 gang itself.
So the S3 area covers 2 districts, Pittsmoor and Burngreave, splitting the S3 gang into 2 separate factions. Both sides are fighting to control their drug-selling territories. But what's more important to them is to reinforce their reputations.
To understand the makeup of this culture and this city, I've enlisted the help of Alan Macaulay, Principal Lecturer in Politics and Sociology at Sheffield's Hallam University. He's going to take me on a tour of the city.
But at the moment we're in a system of cutbacks.
Yeah, it's understanding the gangs in Sheffield is a mixture of politics, of social issues, of drug culture, also of understanding young men in the 21st century, and a lot of them feel almost bypassed. Because of that, you get distortions, whereas, if you and I fell out, we probably wouldn't talk to each other for a few weeks. We certainly wouldn't try and stab each other or ultimately shoot us. It's about, you have, in some cases, disrespected me, and in some other cases, stabbed or defigured someone. So it's then revenge for that. And it's about a reputation that's built up both by word of mouth, but now particularly through social media, through Facebook and all the rest of it. And that is increasingly playing a role in keeping these feuds going on longer. So even in a kind of modern society, they've become isolated and have become outside the norms of Britain in the 2000s. A lot of them have friendships going back years. In fact, some of the S3 people were friends from the ages of 4 and 5. Apparently then fell out over relatively trivial issues, sometimes over a small amount of drug debts, which can in some cases be as small as 50 quid.
So they're not making any money, these gangs?
No, they're disorganised criminals. They're dealing in relatively small amounts of cannabis, crack cocaine, occasionally heroin, although not very often. Their disorganisation has led to levels of violence that are probably unheard of.
A teenager in Sheffield was building his reputation in Pittsmoor S3, but he became targeted by the rival faction. It would be fatal. Around lunchtime, on Friday, July the 11th, 2008, he went into French's Barbers, which stood on the corner of Spittal Street. It was the last haircut he would ever have. Little Chicago was about to show its ugly face. Many disputes begin with a real or perceived breach of street etiquette that slights a gang member's reputation. Members are expected to defend their reps, their reputations, and the most minor incidents can escalate into feuds. In 2008, the teenager was 17 years old. Gifted, popular, and generous, he came from a respectable middle-class family. But despite his upbringing, he became drawn into the street action of the S3 area. It's alleged he had a street pitch to sell cocaine. A composer of rap music, he even boasted in one of his raps that, "I can cause more chaos than World War II." But the S3 territory that he liked to be seen in had become divided. Tensions on his turf were running high and now about to erupt into violence. It all started when one half of the S3 gang accused him of giving away the whereabouts of a cousin of theirs, resulting in him being knifed almost to death. They were now about to teach him a lesson. After following him for 1 week, the gang were ready to strike. In the early hours of Sunday, the 6th of July, he was ambushed outside his home. Here, he was attacked and webbed, which meant being given a stabbing, 7 times in the legs and lower body. The knife narrowly missed his organs. He managed to stagger home, and he was rushed to hospital.
Then, once he'd been treated in hospital for fairly serious injuries, I think he had a perforated liver and things like that, which was pretty bad stuff. Came out after a week, and within a day or so, he was back here in the centre of what is, the area where these gangs operate.
Just 3 days after leaving hospital, he was ready to go out and show his face again and rebuild his rep. But this time, he carried a gun for protection. He made his way back into S3 territory and headed for Spittal Street in Pittsmore. And there was no better way to reinforce his rep than first sharpen up his haircut. French's Barbers was a popular place to hang out and be seen. He left the barbers and was confronted by 3 hooded figures. He took out his black handgun, but raised his arm too late. He was blasted in the back from close range with a sawn-off pump-action Beretta shotgun.
So you were here the day of the murder. Can you tell me what you found when you first came out here? Yeah, chaos really. It was completely sealed off by the police. There were officers all around this corner here. A lot of onlookers who, were obviously shocked and aware that something major had happened here in broad daylight. This is the actual shop where he was when the 2 guys came, opened the door and essentially called him out onto the street. He came out of the shop and was shot in the back here on the street.
But when he came back here, he was holding a gun, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah. He was aware that he was marked in some way and he felt like he needed to have some manner of defending himself.
But it's kind of a brazen comment, isn't it, to say, here I am and I'm not going to be pushed away even though I've been stabbed.
I think it's the bravado that is endemic in this kind of culture, amongst these kind of lads. They do not want to lose face. And I think that's, his father said, I just wish he could have just let it go. But of course he couldn't, because it was about being out there. He was on the internet making, claims about himself, and he was well known. He was a rapper, all this kind of stuff. And he had a name on the street by that point. And of course, when you live in that culture, you have got to defend that name, I think. And that is what he was doing with the gun in his pocket.
He was defending his reputation. 80 years earlier, George Mooney was defending his gambling empire.
In the 1920s, the Mooney gang split and the Park Brigade emerged as a more ruthless bunch, led by Sam Garvin. Garvin was a bookmaker, gambler and promoter of bare-knuckle boxing matches. He had amassed a string of convictions and prison sentences for assault, illegal gaming, con tricks and larceny.
Garvin was a professional criminal, first conviction in 1904, very well connected with local politicians. When the first very decent council houses were built in Sheffield, he got one, and there weren't many of them. In the depths of the Depression, when everybody's living in poverty, he drove a 3-litre Bentley saloon.
Garvin's Park Brigade quickly ousted the Moonies and took over control of the pitch and toss. Now the Moonies were out for revenge. A series of violent tit-for-tat attacks followed.
They attacked one of the Park Brigade in his bed, a man called Bill Furness, one Saturday night in April 1923. They attacked him with hammers, severely injured him, never reported to the police, but there were reprisals. A few days later, one of the Park Brigade was coming away from here, away from the tossing ring, and was slashed with razors over 100 times. Walked down that road there, the road with the graffiti, staggered down there with his head caved in, covered in blood. 100 razor slashes found on him at the infirmary. Wouldn't speak to the police, wouldn't say who'd done it. All he'd say was, I reckon they've spoiled me suit.
I reckon they had spoiled his suit.
They had spoiled his suit.
But the vendetta between the two gangs would culminate in the most violent attack Sheffield had ever seen. It would be an innocent man, a non-gang member called William Plummer, who was going to experience just how ruthless Sam Garvin's Park Brigade could be.
So here we are, Princess Street, scene of the murder of William Plummer.
So tell me about William Plummer. Who was he? What did he do?
William Plummer was a 34-year-old Scotsman. He'd come to Sheffield after the First World War to work in the steelworks. Father of 3 children, he had no connection whatsoever with gangs.
Then how did Plummer get involved?
The night before he was murdered, there was a fight, an altercation between a man called Liversidge and Wilfred Fowler.
Fowler was?
Wilfred Fowler was one of Sam Garvin's gang. Plummer and his wife and others went along to ensure fair play in this fight between Liversidge and Fowler. Liversidge knocked Fowler to the ground and generally got the better of him. Fowler was injured. Plummer helped him up. And instead of being grateful for that, Fowler said to him, Jock, you're going to pay for this. Despite the fact that he'd had nothing to do with the fight at all and he'd helped him off the ground.
I see.
So because one of his lads had been beaten, Sam Garvin was affronted. The old gangster pride or whatever, control. And Garvin rounded up a group of men. They came down here the following night, the end of April 1925, to look for Plummer. They were breathing fire, they talked of murder, they talked of blood flowing down the streets. It was clear that there was going to be trouble, serious trouble, and indeed there was trouble. Plummer came out of his house down there at number 42, walked down here to the corner, and he said, I'll fight you one by one. They didn't want to know about that. Gangs don't work like that, do they? They all jumped upon him.
Around 20 of Garvin's men hit Plummer with pokers, koshes, a piece of lead on a string, and this vicious weapon, ironically called a life preserver, a chair leg with nails in it. Although being badly beaten, Plummer managed to crawl back to the house, but as he struggled towards the door, he was then pounded repeatedly with a child's scooter. Plummer had severe head injuries and 2 great wounds resembling bayonet thrusts through his stomach and side. He was taken to the Royal Infirmary, where he died within minutes.
There'd been slashings, there'd been shootings, there'd been bludgeonings, but he was the first man to be killed. It was the first murder of the Sheffield gang wars.
But it wouldn't be the last. The attack on William Plummer in 1925 was one of the most vicious Sheffield had ever seen. Garvin's gang of up to 20 men, including Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler, had beaten Plummer and killed him. But what of these perpetrators?
The gang dispersed. The Fowler brothers, Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler, both members of the Park Brigade of Sam Garvin's gang, they lingered. When the first police officer arrived, the Fowler brothers were sitting on the chip shop steps. Lawrence Fowler, the police officer said, "What's happened?" Lawrence Fowler said, "I hit him on the head."
He admitted it?
Well, he said, "I hit him on the head." The police officer said, "Be careful, it looks like being serious," as they were going to the police station. And Fowler said, "All right, then I didn't hit him on the head." These were not the brightest of men.
But the leader of the gang, Sam Garvin, was much sharper.
What he'd done, he'd stirred up all the violence here, and then just before it happened, just before the assault on Plummer, on the corner there, he'd hopped on a tram, got off in the Wicker in Sheffield, and assaulted the first man he saw, who just happened to be an old pal of Mooney's, so he recognised him. And thereby, effectively, gave Sam Garvin an alibi.
But this ploy didn't work. Sam Garvin was rounded up, along with 9 other suspects, including the Fowler brothers. They were taken to West Bar police station.
So we're in Sheffield Fire and Police Museum, and this is one of the sort of police cells that the Fowlers would have been brought to after the murder.
This is the old West Bar police station, only 100 yards from where George Mooney lived, right in the heart of Mooneyland. And you've got your tiles, the wooden bench on which they slept, a wooden pillow, old blankets. Many times, many gangmen would have been brought here.
In all, 10 men stood accused of murdering or aiding the murder of William Plummer, including the Fowler brothers, as well as Sam Garvin, the Park Brigade boss. This single investigation exposed the whole criminal network. It was an alarming glimpse into a lawless city. It called for urgent action.
Sheffield had always had a very small police force, just 556 men to police a population of over 500,000. But now this would change because the Sheffield gangs would come under attack from 2 new forces. The first of these hit the streets just 4 days after William Plummer's murder. It was the Flying Squad.
The local authorities were under pressure. They'd been ignoring the issues for a couple of years. It became apparent that they were going to have to do something. The police formed a special duties squad, colloquially known as the Flying Squad. There were 4 men, all First World War veterans, all not averse to fighting, not averse to violence, took the war to the gangs.
Now Sheffield would take another swipe at the gangs. They appointed a new chief constable. He would become Britain's first gangbuster. His name was Percy Sillitoe. Aged 38, Sillitoe was an unorthodox choice. He'd left England to become a trooper in the African police, working in a tough and brutal regime which kept control over native tribes. Now, back in England, Sillitoe would apply the same methods.
He got on with the magistrates. He knew the name of every police officer in the force. He was great for building people's morale up. He backed them up to the hilt. No matter what they did, he supported them. They knew that they could go out and take war to the gangs and that the chief constable would be right behind them.
So why was this any different to the police force before? They were bigger guys.
They were bigger guys, and they went out, they went to publicans and they told them, don't serve gang members. If you serve gang members, we'll oppose your licence. If they saw gang members in the pubs, they hauled them out and battered them. Really? There were no, there was no human rights.
So this was just another gang, really?
Effectively, they'd be fire with fire, steel with steel. Yeah.
So do we know any of these characters?
There was 6'4" Walter Loxley. Now, Walter Loxley was a bit of a local legend all his life, really, because of what happened in the gang troubles. There was a famous occasion where a defendant was in court accused of assaulting Loxley, but the defendant was far smaller than him and covered in blood and bandages and whatever. And his solicitor said to the magistrates, "Your worships, this should not be a case of assaulting the police, it should be a case of attempted suicide."
Sillitoe brought in men like PC Pat Geraghty, who stood 6'5" and could hold 7 tennis balls in one hand. Sillitoe also introduced the European Jiu-Jitsu champion Harry Hunter to train the force in self-defence. After 7 weeks, each man could deal with 60 methods of attack.
The flying squad threw people through windows, they threw them through doors without opening them first. They battered people in public view. They took them round the back occasionally, but they didn't take any prisoners if they didn't need to. On one occasion, they battered a guy in a pub and the landlady fainted.
This is what Sheffield police were presented with on the afternoon of July the 11th, 2008. A hooded teenager lying in a pool of blood outside a barber's shop, a handgun lying nearby.
As if to emphasise the scale of the problem, police in Sheffield said this afternoon that a 17-year-old shot dead at a barber shop yesterday was probably himself carrying a firearm.
Did the police pick up any leads or,
It was very difficult for the police. People just do not want to assist them with their inquiries. They just find themselves up against a brick wall, essentially, a lot of the time. Things just close down,
But then the police got a break, which changed the momentum of their inquiry. The investigation began to make progress. A shotgun was found near the barber's shop hidden in Oscarthorpe Park. It was later proved to be the murder weapon. Eventually, witnesses came forward and named the gang members. But the real breakthrough came when they discovered that one of the gang had a cousin in East Yorkshire, in the Wolds prison.
The police realised that, there was some communication between this guy in prison and the guys on the outside.
How did they establish that?
I think it was essentially they started to look at cell site analysis, which is where the police check where a phone has been at a certain time, and they can then check which phone that phone is calling. So they were able to check the phones of the guys on the outside and realise there was a pattern of calls to this particular number.
Who were the guys that were speaking?
There was a guy inside, Nigel Ramsey, who was known on the street before he was convicted and sent to prison as the General. He had a cousin outside, Denzel Ramsey. They were exchanging phone calls. Nigel Ramsey had a mobile phone inside his cell at the Wolds prison.
It's been estimated that there's a mobile phone, SIM card and phone charger for every 10 inmates across Britain. In one survey conducted in 2009, around 4,000 mobile phones and SIM cards were found. They're smuggled inside in numerous ways, in the soles of trainers like these, in milk cartons, in books, washing powder, even in food. You name it, it's been done.
How would he have got that? It's thought that it was smuggled in on somebody or thrown over a wall and picked up.
So Nigel Ramsey, the General, sanctioned the killing?
That's right. It's thought that he decided that because of his treachery, he would have to be killed. Issued the order over his mobile phone from prison, and that was that.
In 2008, one cell at Wolds prison in East Yorkshire was occupied by Nigel Ramsey, known as the General. He was one of the leaders of the rival S3 gang in Sheffield. Ramsey had been sent to prison for armed robbery and holding up a post office. But this didn't prevent him from organising the murder of a teenager in Sheffield. Just over 1 year after, the case came to trial at Sheffield Crown Court.
What was the atmosphere like around the trial? It was very tense. You can feel the emotion and the animosity there. These were guys who had been part of the same gang, who had then split apart. So the tension there was palpable, really, between the two groups. There were armed police stationed outside this court building because of concerns.
After 5 days of deliberations on August the 7th, 2009, a jury found 4 men guilty of murder. The judge sentenced 23-year-old Nigel Ramsey, the general, to a minimum of 35 years in prison for instigating the murder. 21-year-old Michael Chatu, who pulled the trigger, was given 30 years. 20-year-old Denzel Ramsey, 25 years. And 17-year-old Levan Menzies, 20 years. Sentencing. Mr. Justice Griffith Williams said, Britain is not broken, although certain communities are being plagued by the lawless activities of the likes of you and gangs such as the S3. I make it clear that to protect them, the full rigour of the law must be brought to bear, and rogues like you must be brought to book. 2 members of the gang laughed and joked with each other as the sentences were handed down.
They actually cheered and jeered and kind of shook their fists at the public gallery, and people in the gallery were actually shouting back down at them. It was like it was almost like a triumph. Like, well, yeah, I've got 25 years, you know, I'll do it, and like an achievement almost.
In the late 1920s, gang warfare in Sheffield had caught national attention. The murder of William Plummer had shocked the nation. Over 8,000 people attended his funeral. They were visibly protesting against the violence that was plaguing their streets. The murder trial of William Plummer's attackers opened on Tuesday, July the 28th, 1925. 10 men stood accused of William Plummer's murder. The crucial issue was who had struck the fatal blow. The bayonet wound Plummer received had killed him, and although the bayonet was never found, Wilfred Fowler was seen jabbing Plummer with it.
There were 80 witnesses in all, 50 who'd been at the scene, another 30 of medical, forensics, whatever people. All travelled over to Leeds for 4 days, 4-day trial before Mr. Justice Finlay. And at the end of it, Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler were found guilty of murder. 3 other men were found guilty of manslaughter and got penal servitude.
It's hard to imagine because they were all involved in the beating of this man, and yet only 2 of them get found guilty of murder.
A handful, literally a handful of all the witnesses said they saw Wilfred Fowler with a bayonet. Others said they'd seen Lawrence Fowler hitting Plummer with a truncheon. They were the 2 key ones in the whole melee, I guess.
After the trial, both Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler were sentenced to death by hanging. Although Sam Garvin, the leader of the Park Brigade, was not involved in Plummer's murder, he did assault a man when he tried to create his alibi, and for that he got 20 months. But what happened to his arch-rival, George Mooney?
George Mooney went to jail for biting a man's ear off on a train coming back from a race meeting.
Hungry, I guess.
Yeah. He was on an ear diet. Right. Several of the other principals in both the old Mooney gang and the more recent Park Brigade were in jail.
So even before the Second World War started, they were all dissipated?
It was all done and dusted by 1927.
By that time, the heavy-handed tactics used by Percy Sillitoe and the flying squad quickly turned the city around. The crimes of the Mooney gang and the Park Brigade were brought to an end. Soon, newspapers were reporting success after success as Sheffield's gangs were eliminated. Many said that the flying squad were no better than the gangs themselves, but no one doubted their effectiveness. The murder of William Plummer shocked Sheffield and was a wake-up call for all police forces. It highlighted the horrific nature of gang warfare and its irrational, uncontrolled violence.
That same horror confronted the teenager's family in 2008. Our son used to have lots of friends, and his main mistake was that he trusted some of those who he should not have trusted. They handed him the death sentence, and for his family and friends, the life sentence. It's such a waste of young life, thrown away all because of dented pride. I want to find out if Sheffield is going to be able to solve this deep-rooted problem. So tell me about the future for Sheffield.
We've certainly seen a fall-off in public gang activity since the shootings. The police have been much more high profile. There's been much more investment going on that the City Council has developed with its youth services a gang strategy, which does appear to have made a real difference. But the police have taken a much more interventionist approach. They've now been targeting individuals, using warrants to arrest people and basically using much more intelligence-driven policing, I think, which has resulted in a fall-off in activity. And I think also some of the peripheral people involved in the gangs walked away at that point as well.
Yeah.
You know, the ones who began to think, well, you know, it might be him today, but it could be me tomorrow.
Over the last 8 years, 10 lives were lost in gang violence in the city. A long-running police operation targeting drug and gang crime led to more than 50 arrests, with more than 200 police officers taking part in the raids. Today in Sheffield, there's a number of new initiatives to steer young people away from gangs. One of these is called Zest for Sport.
Sheffield particularly has problems with the old postcode gangs, as they're sort of referred to, particularly the S3, S6 gangs, gangs within inner city areas of Sheffield. They are present, they do go on, however they tend to be more serious crime, which fortunately our young people are not involved in. We're in what's called the central ward of Sheffield, just outside Sheffield city centre, which is a deprived inner city area of Sheffield. Through some of the activities that we do here at Zest, we've been successful in reducing low levels of antisocial behaviour by 50%. We work closely with the police on that.
I've experienced stuff in South Africa that can then benefit these kids. They've asked me a lot about my experiences and tried to compare gang culture, like how kids respond to sport in South Africa, how, you know, how culturally it's different. And I think that, you know, it's important for them to learn about that aspect as well, and to realise, you know, the great opportunity they have at Zest, because I've worked with gangs on the streets, I've worked in South Africa, I've worked in extreme poverty, and I've seen how much things can mean to people. And I think before that time that I told them, it was as though they'd taken off, you know, their tinted glasses and realised, oh, actually.
The centre aims to provide a base for young people to come together rather than be divided by race, culture or class. And more importantly in this city, to break down the borders that exist between different areas and territories.
We work together to break down the barriers so that young people can feel that they can leave their sort of territory areas and go into other areas and feel safe to do so. Young people like to affiliate with a group, and that can be in a positive way, and it can lead, unfortunately, to in a negative way. But I think more and more young people aren't given the opportunity that they need and that they crave. In very few communities do they have a place to go that's safe, that they can access. Unfortunately, young people are being forced to grow up very quickly, which is very difficult on them. It's a huge amount of pressure now to be a young person.
In South Africa, you're dealing with quite high-level gang crime, gang violence on the streets, and a lot of the kids that you work with are involved in that, whereas here they see it as something to go out and play around in, whereas there is something that when you come onto the streets, you're in a gang. You know, you have to choose, whereas here, kids have choices, and that's what I try and tell them. You know, I say to them, you've got education, you've got a family at home, you've got all these, you know, brilliant activities to get involved with, and still some people stand there and say, well, I want more. And I think that that's where they need educating in terms of, you know, the vast opportunities that are available to them.
In 2008, the murder was a frightening insight into a culture where carrying a knife or a gun with intent to use it had become a shocking normality. Violence is something which is learned, so it can also be unlearned. The Sheffield police now work with young offenders to break the cycle of crime by behaviour change, with great success. Violent crime in Sheffield has declined, and gun crime has fallen.
Over the course of this series, we've been looking at gangs, old and new, from across some of Britain's cities.
Gangs have risen and fallen. They prosper now as they've always done. They continue to find new ways of making money and fending off their rivals.
We've seen how you joined gangs, how they operated, what they stood for. We've learned how they've moved from gambling into clubs and protection, and now into drug importation and dealing.
But is there a pattern to criminality? Are there similarities between these gangs? Or are they solely products of their era?
We're going to look at the reasons why we have gangs, how they make their money, how they hold on to it, and what has been done to try and break them. Gangs have always been with us, and it's easy to see why. They offer self-preservation, comradeship, a sense of belonging. For some, joining a gang means prestige, and for a few, it means power. But there are countless reasons beyond the pack instinct why people join gangs. In the 19th century, living in one of Britain's industrial cities, it was an alternative family, a home on the street away from the overcrowded slum. The gang could also give you respect. But that you'd have to earn. On the streets of Manchester in the late 1800s, you could earn respect as a scuttler. Long before there were hoodies and scallies, there were the scuttlers, the first youth cult. I'm about to meet a man who I hope can tell me a little bit about them. Andrew Davis is a historian and author who has researched the gangs of Manchester. So Andrew, tell me about the scuttlers. What were the scuttlers?
Scuttlers were gang members. They were young lads, working class lads, aged in their teens, more or less from the age of leaving school up to sort of 20, 21. And scuttler was a very specific term. It meant you were a gang member. It meant you had a certain look. It's a slang term with its origins on the streets.
So what would they do? Would they be stealing, or were they running gambling, or...?
Scuttling gangs really are territorial gangs. They're neighbourhood or street gangs, and really they're fighting gangs rather than criminal gangs. They're usually named after the street, maybe the thoroughfare where they would gather on the corners. So it would be an area-based name. So you might have a gang from Hope Street, Salford. The most famous gangs had more exotic names. There was a gang from Ancoats from Bengal Street who went under the name the Bengal Tigers. Wow. So they're looking to invest a little bit of glamour, something exotic in their activities.
And is that all it was really about? Sort of just respect and power?
It's very much about pride in your area, and it's about pride in yourself and your friends as well. So a lot of this is about keeping young people from other districts outside what you define as your patch.
Scuttlers became the first youth cult. They had a distinctive look. Short hair, but with a long fringe. Worn in a parting and plastered down with soap on the forehead over the left eye. The dress signalled to everyone that a scuttler was no ordinary working-class lad, but a street fighter. It was one thing to look dandy and impressive, but some of their dress had other, more vicious functions. For example, these clogs, heavy, pointed, and with brass toe caps, good for close-up combat. Their belts were another part of their armoury. They would have a heavy brass buckle, which they'd sharpen along the edge, so it became like a blade. They'd also bang nails or bolts through the end to add more weight when swung. It was said that a hit from one of these could split a man's skull.
And And was the fighting just random, just people just getting angry and attacking people, or was there was an order to the way they fought?
I think it's very, very targeted. One of the things that you realise about Scotland is they all know each other. The gangs would actually chalk the threat or the invitation to fight. They'd chalk the challenge either on a wall or maybe on the pavement. So there would be a day and a time, Saturday, 3 o'clock, Adelphi against Greengate. So it really is battling by appointment. They're very often carrying and they're using knives as well. But it's very, very rare that anybody gets killed. So generally what they're looking to do is to maim or to scar.
The Scutlers fought for little but their own respect. They simply liked fighting. They liked proving how tough they were. They didn't make any money out of it. There was no master plan. But in other cities, street gangs could be very different. Glasgow was once the most overcrowded city in Britain, as well as the poorest. In the late 1800s, immigrants from Ireland, fleeing the second wave of the potato famine, came to work on Clydeside. They formed large Catholic neighbourhoods in the Protestant city. For many, their arrival was unwelcome competition and created resentment, hatred, and in some cases, violence. One area which became a flashpoint bordering Catholic districts was called Bridgeton, or Brigton. And this was home to an infamous Protestant gang, the Brigton Boys, soon to be known as the Billy Boys. They took their name from William of Orange, the Dutch-born king who in the 17th century annexed Northern Ireland and installed the Protestant church. The Billy Boys were devotees of King Billy.
Legend has it that the gang was formed in 1924 by a man who came from this street. His name was William Fullerton.
Billy Fullerton, who formed them, according to the story, was beaten up by a gang of Catholics when he was in his late teens, and he decided that he would form his own gangs to basically anything they could do, he could do bloodier.
In the 1930s, the rivalry between the Protestant and Catholic was played out on the football pitch, with the west of the town supporting Rangers and the east supporting Celtic.
In spite of the weather, we saw Celtic trying their skill against the Rangers. Celtic kicked off and run straight into the attack.
The Billy Boys used their loyalty to Rangers as a way of attacking Catholics.
Real trouble breaking out on the terraces here.
They would infiltrate the Rangers fans to provoke battles with Celtic supporters.
The referee has stopped the match, as they would have to do, of course.
The sectarian gangs of Glasgow, like the Billy Boys, were not alone. Immigrants always faced opposition across Britain's cities.
The Irish settled in Liverpool and also by the docks in London. But there wasn't just the Irish. Italian immigrants settled in Clerkenwell, Russian Jews in Whitechapel, and even today, there are still immigrant gangs around the country. Tensions could snap at any time. In Southall, West London in 1976, they did just that, with the stabbing of an Asian student by a white gang. Young Asians who had put up with attacks from teddy boys now had to face much more powerful groups, like the National Front. The Asian community defended itself by forming gangs. I'm meeting up with a man who has done a lot of research into this, journalist and crime writer, Tony Thompson.
First of all, tell me about, when did gangs first emerge in this area?
Well, around the Southall area, they really started around the late 60s, early 70s, which was around the same time that we started to get a large population of people from the Indian subcontinent coming to this part of London and setting up shop here. In the early days when they were being here, there was a lot of racism, a lot of people being attacked by sort of people like the National Front and so on. And they started to defend themselves by gathering together in vigilante gangs to defend themselves against the racists. But what happened was once the threat from the racists started to fade a little bit, those gangs stayed around, started attacking each other and started preying on the local community themselves.
And it was the same story in other cities. During the 1970s, the black community in Birmingham felt threatened.
Just tell me a bit about why gangs started in Birmingham.
Well, originally the gangs, certainly the black and Asian gangs, started off as, you could say, almost vigilante gangs. There was a big problem with skinheads and the right wing in certain parts of Birmingham, and these gangs formed essentially to look after their own communities.
But in 1981, tensions exploded in vicious race riots. Heavy-handed policing only inflamed the aggression on the streets as groups of young black youths began to take the law into their own hands.
It kind of empowered a lot of the young black kids, and that they thought, well, hang on, we've rioted, we managed to put the police on the back foot, you know, we can show some force when we want to. Eventually, as the right-wing threat dissipated, they kept that organisation together, and it became more of a criminal network. As drugs started coming into the community, they used those bonds and those links they had and directed towards criminal efforts instead.
Once gangs have become established, it's not always easy to decommission them. What may have started as a means of protection can also become a means of making money. The revenues that can be brought in by using such a large number of loyal supporters can be too tempting to resist. During the First World War, times were tough. For many living in the northern cities, only the manufacture of armaments kept men in work. The wages they brought home were just enough to keep their families alive. Their future, what they could see of it, was bleak. Their only ray of hope in such depressed times was gambling. And in the city of Sheffield, that meant a game called pitch and toss. With local historian J.P. Bean, I've come to see where the gangs here in the 1920s made their money.
This is Sky Edge, an ideal place for pitch and toss, which one of the most simple forms of gambling, but here vast sums were bet. A man called Jack White, who was a publican from Barnsley, was known to regularly bet £50 on one single toss of the coin.
Huge sum of money.
Huge sum of money. The organisers of the ring took 4 shillings in the pound as a toll. The toller ran the ring. George Mooney here was the toller. So somebody put £1 on, the pound went on the floor as the bet, 4 shillings went in George Mooney's pocket.
Sheffield was not alone. There were pitch and toss rings all around the country. Gambling was big business. And in the 1920s, there was no greater gambling business than horse racing, turning over £500 million a year. Racetracks became an industry for the gangs. And the biggest gang who made the most was an outfit from Birmingham called the Brummagem. After the First World War, racecourses were the only legal gambling places. But the bulging satchels of the bookmakers attracted criminal gangs wanting a piece of the action, and the Brummagems wanted the biggest slice. I've come to meet a former member of the Met's flying squad, police historian Dick Kirby.
Dick.
Gary, delighted to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you. So I suppose the first question is, you know, what did the Brummagems see in racecourses? Why were they here?
Well, they saw an awful lot of money. In those days, before the First World War, practically anybody could set up as a bookmaker.
Oh, right.
There were no real rules and regulations, and the bookmakers just paid out if they could afford it. And if they didn't, they hired bodyguards to protect them from enraged punters who wanted their winnings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Brummagems soon got into every illegal trick in the book, as historian Carl Chin explains.
Blokes would go up to somebody and say, hey, to a bookie, you're the bookie. Oh, give us 10 bob for poor old Fred, he's just come out of nick. Right. Poor old Fred hadn't come out of nick. Poor old Alf's just going into nick, give us 10 bob. Or else even cruder, if you don't give me £1, I'm going to turn you upside down.
Right.
So a lot of bookmakers hired minders, tough boxers. It was might rules.
I see.
And so whether you were bookmakers or punters, if gangs came along and preyed upon you, you were struggling.
And the gang that posed the greatest danger and controlled the most racecourses was the Brummagems. The gang charged bookmakers as much as 50% of their profits for the privilege of being left unmolested. In turn, some of the bookies began to use the gang's services to dissuade winning punters from pressing their claims for payment. You didn't have to run a national horse racing racket to make money. There was a living to be made out of good old honest thieving if a gang had enough men out on the street. And not all gang members were men. One gang, called the 40 Thieves from South London, was run by a formidable woman called Alice Diamond. In 1916, aged 20, Alice Diamond became queen of the 40 Thieves and would transform them. Dressed in specially tailored clothes complete with hidden pockets, Diamond and her crew raided some of the West End's biggest stores: Debenhams, D.H. Evans, Selfridges and Whiteley's. Diamond's girls dressed smart. They never wore any stolen goods, and they gave the impression they were cut from finer cloth. But underneath their glamorous outfits were hidden surprises. Their jackets had deep inside pockets to contain plundered goods. Tailored cummerbunds, muffs, skirts, and even hats sewn with hidden pockets. One key innovation was to wear extra voluminous knickers to hide their ill-gotten gains.
They had a name for the knickers, didn't
Yeah, they were called hoisting knickers, like from to hoist. And so that's how they got the name the Oysters.
But that's what I like, because hoister becomes oyster if you drop the H. The oyster knickers is great. I love that. I'm sure we could make them now.
They liked to steal small, exclusive things. Then there was lingerie, silk, designer clothes, furs, leather goods. It all just vanished.
How would they do a raid on, say, one of the shops here?
Well, what would happen? They'd arrive probably by car and park somewhere sneaky. And the car was very important. It needed a big boot so they could go backwards and forwards and load up. And they would all carry identical type bags and gradually go in the shops one by one. The first two would start loading the gear. The next person to come in would swap the bag and take the others out. And so there's only one chance of one person being arrested, while the others gradually moved around them. And sometimes they'd create a distraction, so they'd pretend to faint or if they were taken ill, and then cause a big havoc in the store. And so people were looking at the wrong thing. But actually, a lot of the technique was about rolling the stuff very small and packing it in. And you have to remember, nowadays we have very different types of technology. We have CCTV, we have all sorts of detection networks. Then it was a free-for-all.
Some gangs were not as subtle as the 40 Thieves. One gang who came to prominence was certain members of a Turkish Cypriot family from South East London. They were four brothers: Bakir, Mehmet, Dennis and Dogan.
In the 80s, the Arabs were kings. They were running everything. They seemed to be getting away with everything. Even when they got nicked, they got off. Yeah, they really were becoming legendary figures. But then in late 1990, everything started to unravel. They decided to hold up a security van in Reigate in Surrey. What they didn't realise was that one of their associates had tipped off the police, who in fact encouraged the entire robbery to still go ahead.
On the 27th of November, two of the gang set off. They tracked the Securical van on its way to Reigate. The van was carrying large amounts of money to branches of Barclays Bank. Mehmet and Dennis Arif were on the job themselves, along with Dennis's brother-in-law and a hardened armed robber called Kenny Baker. They all tooled up with an assortment of guns. But unknown to them, the police were all on red alert. The Securical van had become the bait, and the Arifs the catch. In the centre of Reigate, the Securical van pulled over and came to a halt.
The security van has stopped. The man and woman security guard have got out to go and get a coffee, and the Arifs and their friends swoop, and they swoop with a vengeance. They were wearing Ronald Reagan masks, which must have been absolutely terrifying, because the police have turned up, because of course they knew about it, they were waiting. They were there planning to nick them all. This was in commuter belt town south of London. The police are not going to let go, they're going to get this mob if whatever happens. Yeah. And unfortunately, one of the other robbers, Baker, was shot dead. The Arifs were nicked, and this was a pivotal moment for them. It was a pivotal moment because it was the beginning of the decline of the Arifs, because it broke the family up in a way they'd never been broken up before.
Mehmet and Dennis, together with their brother-in-law Anthony Downer, were arrested. Kenny Baker lay dead.
Gangs made their fortune from just about every illegal practice going. But drugs were always going to bring in the most money. Drugs changed the face of gangland Britain. Some gangs, like the Tootie Nung, poured all their money into heroin. It all depended upon couriers, trusted friends or families from the gang, and usually women. They would be flown out of Heathrow to India or Pakistan. They would usually go for a few weeks and be able to visit their families and have a paid holiday. But on their return, they would bring back heroin. Boarding and body checks in Pakistan could be easily avoided. The gang wielded considerable power there. Officials could be bribed to turn a blind eye. But it was the return trip to Heathrow where the gang's ingenuity and planning would be critical. With vigilant customs officials and the latest scanning devices, it would be risky trying to smuggle the drugs through customs. But the Tootie Nung had a simple, undetectable and foolproof solution. When the couriers entered the baggage reclaim area, they would slip off to the ladies' toilets. There, they would remove the packages of heroin. Each courier had been given a key to the tampon dispenser. Here the drugs were hidden, and the courier, now totally clean, could pass through customs and leave the airport. Now, there was just one more link in the operation. The gang had people employed at the airport as cleaners. As soon as the couriers had cleared, their job was now to move and pick up the drugs. Once in their hands, it was no problem to take the drugs out of the airport. With so many people regularly going back and forth, nothing looked out of the ordinary. This operation didn't raise any suspicions. The Tootie Nung were bringing in 10 kilos a day, worth £100,000. They did this for 10 years. That's £365 million. Docks and airports. They open up all sorts of possibilities for gangs. They did for the Liverpool Mafia and for one gangster called Curtis Warren, a leading figure in an international drug smuggling ring who controlled much of Britain's cocaine business. In 1991, Warren flew to Venezuela to set up a big cocaine shipment from the Cali cartel.
Just to give you an idea of the planning, the cocaine was shipped inside 32 lead ingots, this big. It meant that they couldn't be x-rayed, and to cut them open would take hours. It's also said that Warren knew the length of the drill bits that the customs used, 25 centimetres long. Now just take a look at this. 25 centimetres means you can't get anywhere near the centre. It was with such ingenuity he made the Liverpool Mafia Britain's first and most successful drug cartel. When the ingots arrived in England, customs cut one open, but found nothing and let the shipment through. Only then were they tipped off that they contained cocaine. But it was too late. The ingots were already on their way to Liverpool. Inside was the cocaine. Warren's cut was an estimated £87 million.
Once a gang has cornered a market, it has to control it. It can't afford to let another gang push it off its turf.
Gangs have always controlled their members and territory with threats and with violence. Any breach of loyalty could be dealt with in the most brutal way, even by death. The worst conflicts have taken place when a gang has split into two groups. This divides not only the gang members, but the territory as well, putting both under intense scrutiny, each side watching for an opportunity to provoke or attack the other. Gang feuds can last for decades. The tit-for-tat violence that ensues often spills out, endangering the lives of innocent people. This is what happened in Sheffield in the 1920s. A gangster called George Mooney had run a highly lucrative and illegal pitch-and-toss betting ring at Sky Edge above Sheffield. But when he slimmed down his operation by laying off some of his henchmen, they formed a rival gang called the Park Brigade. They were led by a man called Sam Garvin. Garvin was a bookmaker, gambler and promoter of bare-knuckle boxing matches. He had amassed a string of convictions and prison sentences for assault,
illegal gaming, con tricks and larceny.
Garvin was a professional criminal, first conviction in 1904, very well connected with local politicians. When the first very decent council houses were built in Sheffield, he got one, and there weren't many of them. In the depths of the Depression, when everybody's living in poverty, he drove a 3-litre Bentley saloon.
Now Garvin's gang, the Park Brigade, would begin a vicious feud with the Mooney gang and push gang warfare in Sheffield to a new level of violence, earning the city the name of Little Chicago.
They attacked one of the Park Brigade in his bed, a man called Bill Furness, one Saturday night in April 1923. They attacked him with hammers, severely injured him, never reported to the police, but there were reprisals. A few days later, one of the Park Brigade was coming away from here, away from the tossing ring, and was slashed with razors over 100 times. Wouldn't speak to the police, wouldn't say who'd done it. All he'd say was, I reckon they've spoiled me suit.
I reckon they had spoiled his suit.
They had spoiled his suit.
But the vendetta between the two gangs would culminate in the most violent attack Sheffield had ever seen. It would be an innocent man, a non-gang member called William Plummer, who was going to experience just how ruthless Sam Garvin's Park Brigade could be.
Princess Street, scene of the murder of William Plummer.
So tell me about William Plummer. Who was he? What did he do?
William Plummer was a 34-year-old Scotsman. He'd come to Sheffield after the First World War to work in the steelworks. Father of 3 children, he had no connection whatsoever with gangs.
But one evening, Plummer witnessed a violent fight. One of Mooney's men had been badly beaten, and Plummer had helped him to his feet. Unbeknown to him, the rival gang, led by Sam Garvin, now saw this as a reason to make him a target. Around 20 of Garvin's men hit Plummer with pokers, koshes, a piece of lead on a string, and this vicious weapon, ironically called a life preserver, a chair leg with nails in it. Although being badly beaten, Plummer managed to crawl back to the house, but as he struggled towards the door, he was then pounded repeatedly with a child's scooter. Plummer had severe head injuries and 2 great wounds resembling bayonet thrusts through his stomach and side. He was taken to the Royal Infirmary, where he died within minutes.
There'd been slashings, there'd been shootings, there'd been bludgeonings, but he was the first man to be killed. It was the first murder of the Sheffield gang wars.
It doesn't always have to be a split within a gang to create the violence. Rival gangs come up against the same brutality. In the 1950s, the Krays were a new breed of criminal, bringing with them a new type of violence, extreme and unpredictable. They were so terrifying, they made some gangs, like the Watney Streeters, simply run away.
This is where Reggie, Ronnie, Billy Jones and Bobby Ramsey came looking for the Watney Streeters who had done up Ramsey. What happened was the Streeters got wind that the Krays mob was on its way. In the front was a fellow who got nothing to do with it, but was related to the Streeters, a man called Terry Martin. Out the back go the Watney Streeters, whom the Krays are really looking for. And there's poor old Terry Martin in front, left really more or less on his own. He's dragged out and given a stabbing with the bayonet.
By who?
By
you know?
Ronnie, and possibly Bobby Ramsey. It's difficult to know who really does what, but they all give him a terrible hammer.
So just here on this
just
pavement?
Just here on this pavement, yeah.
And where the Watney Streeters
have decamped, yes, very sensibly.
More recent gangs who deal in drugs are just as violent. Drug dealing kickstarts a miserable cycle of addiction, crime and violence. For the gangs lower down in the supply chain, control of their drug turf is crucial. At street level, the violence they dish out is to be seen and feared. Sometimes it spills out, ruining the lives of innocent people. This is what happened in Manchester with the Gooch Gang. This was the Gooch Gang leader, Colin Joyce, known as the General. And this is Lee Amos, the other top man. They've been described by one senior copper as psychopaths who shoot for fun. These guys were at war with the Doddington gang and the Longsight crew. And in 5 years of shooting, 250 people were wounded and 27 were killed. These tit-for-tat killings culminated in 2 brutal shootings. They would shock not only Manchester, but the whole country, becoming a landmark in gang violence and ultimately bringing about the downfall of the Gooch gang. Our story begins at 6:45, 15th of June 2007, right here on the corner of Anson Road, Longsight, South Manchester. A young man called Ukal Chin was gunned down in a roadside ambush. I want to find out how this happened, how an innocent man got caught up in a gangland shooting. So we're here on Anson Road. Ukal Chin got shot here, right?
Yeah. He'd been driving about with some friends that day. Colin Joyce, one of the senior members of the Gooch gang, was driving up and down looking for a Longsight crew member or associate to go after. Somewhere along Anson Road, he spots Ukal Chin. The vehicle that he's in draws parallel to the Renault that Ukal is driving and opens fire, and Ukal's killed. The likelihood is he was after Ukal.
Why? Because he thought he was part of Longsight?
Ukal came up in an area where gang membership is simply defined by who your friends are. You might have friends who are more involved than you are, but you become associated with their gang because they're your friends. They might be the friends that you went to primary school with. They might be the friends that you've grown up playing football with, but that's enough to label you, and if you happen to be driving these lads about on a particular day and your face becomes associated with them, then it's a question of perception. That was enough to get Ukal killed, unfortunately.
Just as Manchester had the Gooch gang, Birmingham had the Johnson crew. Their callous displays of violence would shock the city. On the 2nd of January 2003, a revenge attack by a rival mob called the Burger Bar Boys would result in the murder of 2 innocent girls and shock the city and the nation. The incident was sparked when the Burger Bar Boys spotted their rivals, the Johnson crew, at a party held at a hair salon. They decided to attack them in a drive-by shooting.
The woman who ran the hair salon had had this New Year's Day party for the last few years. It was well known, so they tagged along, And the party, by all accounts, was, a normal affair. There was nothing unusual about it until the early hours of the morning when people reported that the atmosphere started getting very dark. There was rumours around that there's going to be trouble, something's going to happen.
The car pulled into position, not far from the party. Inside, 3 members of the Burger Bar Boys were armed, one of them with a Mac-10 machine gun.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, the place was winding up. People were piling out the back and basically just getting some fresh air.
So the party spills out onto the street. Within a split second, 23 empty cartridges are spewed out from the machine gun. Charlene Ellis was the first to die, hit 3 times. Letitia Shakespeare was also killed, hit 4 times. I went to see Letitia's mother, Marcia, who had to go and identify her daughter only hours after the shooting.
As soon as I went into the room, I could see Letitia, she had a hairpiece on that day. And I could see that was like slinched to one side. I thought, well, this is Letitia. So I came round to have a look, and she was there on the bed, but her eyes were wide open.
Really?
I've never seen her eyes that wide open.
Yeah.
And I still couldn't absorb that she was dead. I still thought she was alive. I said, no, she's alive. Her eyes are open. She's got to be alive. And when I was walking around and looking, and when I looked, because her eyes were so open, you could see like where like the blood shot, like the shock initially just killed her. She didn't have time to even close her eyes. That horror stopped with me for about 4 weeks. I kept having nightmares, panic attacks, just couldn't. Thought, nah, that hasn't happened. I didn't really think it happened.
You can't believe it. You just can't take it in when something like that happens, can you?
No, I couldn't.
To the gangs, violence is just a way of life. Most of us remain unaware of it. But when it flares up and takes an innocent life, we are barely able to comprehend how this can be happening on our streets.
How do you eliminate gangs? Well, one way is to remove their source of income. Look what happened to the prohibition of alcohol in America. When liquor was legalized again, the gangsters were forced to move off into other business. Another method was to target the gangsters themselves. This was the strategy used in the 1920s to eliminate the gangs of Sheffield.
The local authorities were under pressure. They'd been ignoring the issues for a couple of years. It became apparent that they were going to have to do something. The police formed a special duties squad, colloquially known as the Flying Squad.
They appointed a new chief constable. He would become Britain's first gangbuster. His name was Percy Sillitoe. Aged 38, Sillitoe was an unorthodox choice. He'd left England to become a trooper in the African police, working in a tough and brutal regime which kept control over native tribes. Now, back in England, Sillitoe would apply the same methods.
He knew the name of every police officer in the force. They knew that they could go out and take war to the gangs and that the chief constable would be right behind them.
So why was this any different to the police force before? They were bigger guys.
They were bigger guys, and they went out, they went to publicans and they told them, don't serve gang members. If you serve gang members, we'll oppose your licence. If they saw gang members in the pubs, they hauled them out and battered them. There were no, there was no human rights.
So this was just another gang, really?
Effectively, they'd be fire with fire, steel with steel.
Sillitoe brought in men like PC Pat Geraghty, who stood 6'5" and could hold 7 tennis balls in one hand. Sillitoe also introduced the European Jiu-Jitsu champion, Harry Hunter, to train the force in self-defence. After 7 weeks, each man could deal with 60 methods of attack.
The Flying Squad threw people through windows, they threw them through doors without opening them first. They battered people in public view. They took them around the back occasionally, but they didn't take any prisoners if they didn't need to.
Sillitoe was seen at the time as a great success. He became Britain's first gangbuster and was also sent up to Glasgow. During the 1930s, the Billy Boys remained the most powerful gang in Glasgow. Marching behind their leader, Billy Fullerton, they set out to taunt the Catholic neighbourhoods. The Billy Boys came marching down this street, Norman Street, inflaming the Catholic locals with their music. A large Catholic razor gang, known as the Norman Conks, who lived in this street, often prepared to retaliate when they heard the Billy Boys approaching.
The Norman Conks knew they were coming, heard they were coming because they weren't creeping up on them, and would ambush them. So from the windows, from roofs if they could get onto them, they would attack them, throw missiles, throw bottles, throw dirt, anything at all, human waste. And then down in the street there would be a battle royal going on.
But by 1935, the Glasgow police, now under the command of gangbuster Percy Sillitoe, set out to ambush the gangs. Police mounted a charge led by Sillitoe's Cossacks, as his force were known. It was the beginning of the end for the Billy Boys. Sillitoe ordered the mounted police to Celtic Park, together with 2 large covered vans filled with policemen. They hid down a side street. There they waited.
But they were clever with it. They didn't wade in at the height of battle. They waited until both sides had more or less worn each other out, and then the police would come in and mop it up in a far more ferocious way on occasion.
This road here became littered with casualties. The police had broken up the parade, scoring an historic victory. According to Sillitoe, only one of the Billy Boys escaped without injury. It was Elijah Cooper, the big drum player, who hid in his drum until he could surrender peacefully.
Today, gang-related crimes can be the most complicated to solve. Often it's hard to work out just who's innocent and who's guilty, who's in one faction and who's in another. In Birmingham, Police officers collected 1,300 statements, recovered 40 vehicles, and put tens of thousands of man-hours into bringing down the murderers of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare. To put away the Gooch Gang in Manchester, prosecution lawyers scrutinised 50,000 pages of evidence, 80,000 mobile phone calls, and offered unprecedented protection to witnesses in order for them to talk. It paid off. The Gooch Gang were put away for a very long time. Only with this level of investigation can gangs be brought to justice. Even Curtis Warren, who often appeared to be one step ahead with his drug trafficking empire, was eventually cornered. On October the 24th, 1996, Dutch SWAT units raided a warehouse in Holland and Warren's home.
And through a complex kind of undercover surveillance operation involving wiretaps, they managed to catch him red-handed, bringing in another superload of cocaine.
The top 5 men in Warren's drug ring were among the 10 men dragged from their beds and arrested. The police confiscated 400 kilograms of cocaine, 60 kilos of heroin, 1,500 kilos of cannabis, and 50 kilos of ecstasy. Their street value, £125 million. Simultaneously, British police searched premises across northwest England to arrest the gang's other cohorts.
He goes to trial, it stacks up, and he goes to jail for a long time.
During this series, I've been walking around some of the estates. I saw the same problems that existed 100 years ago. I see kids with nothing to do, locked into cul-de-sacs that they just can't escape from. It's almost impossible for them to go anywhere unnoticed. Many are from traditional immigrant families, desperate to find their own identity out on the street, where it's all about respect, and sometimes violence. So where do we go from here? Where's the Percy Sillito of the 21st century? Well, let me tell you, it's right here. Strathclyde's Violence Reduction Unit. I'm about to meet Karen McCluskey. She's a director of this unit, which she set up in 2008. She's responsible for bringing about a radical new approach in tackling gangs. She did what no one had ever dared do before. She hauled in all the gangs and laid down the law to them.
We wanted to try and make a big change because you can't just take 10 people. It has to be about hundreds to achieve a real big shift in gangs.
So how'd you do that?
We had to get the parents, we had to get the schools, we had to convince them to come in.
So you were putting rival gangs in the same room?
All of them. I mean, this was about, it's a really risky strategy. And the chief stood up and we flashed their pictures around the room. And we said, we know who you are, we know where you live. And he said, I'm so powerful, I can have them all outside your front door if I so wish, my corpse. I can make your life really difficult. It's not hard, but we want you to stop. We want you to stop this because I don't want to go and see your parents and tell them that you're dead or they're coming to arrest you for a murder. And then we get a surgeon to stand up and he says, you boys might not know what you're doing, but let me tell you what I get in my surgery. And he shows them the pictures. And some of them are really graphic, but that's what he says, we have some of the worst cases of facial injury anywhere in the world here. They cannot look at it. And we have had a few fainters. And then I suppose the best and the worst part is we get a mum to stand up. And it is just, unless you'd seen it, it's very difficult to explain. But she stands up and she says, you boys might not care about yourself, but here's what happened to my son when I cradled him when he died. And I go into his room every single day and I will never get over it. It's destroyed my husband, it's destroyed my family, and I cared about my son. And you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom.
I know exactly
and
where
you can hear
from.
them sobbing in the back. Because regardless of how beleaguered some of these families are, they love their mothers.
Yeah.
And it's the most powerful thing ever. And we then say, make a choice. You can make a choice here. And the really interesting thing is, for lots of the people that we deal with, they've got no choice about where they're born, what parents they're born to, what school they go to, even what gang they go into. This sometimes is the first time in their life that they've had a choice. And it is amazing how many of them stand up in the court and say, I want out.
I tell you, I can't... I'm shocked at what I've just seen in there. Karen off camera showed us some CCTV footage of some gang violence, but real gang violence. It kind of hit home what this show's all about. It was just sickening to see kids acting like that. And it's places like this that are working towards kind of fixing the problem. I'm still not convinced that it's a problem that can be fixed. I think it goes a lot deeper down than just the one gang, you know, trying to take knives away, or I think it's ingrained, the problem. Listen, we can only hope.
100 years ago, lads on the street in a poor area had few prospects and no real voice or rights. Joining a gang gave them a sense of belonging. The authorities pinpointed poor housing, lack of family control, and boredom as key causes. This still holds true today.
But the big difference now is that many gangs deal in drugs, and the drugs they sell contaminate their neighborhood, blighting the futures of those who touch them.
Gangs will only stop selling drugs when the demand is removed. And only education or a change in the law can alter that.
Many of the cities we've looked at in the course of this series have seen major gangs put away for a very long time. And with targeted policing, education and social initiatives, there's been a fall in violent gang crime. Let's hope it stays that way.
Liverpool, the Venice of the North, and its lifeblood, the River Mersey. From the very beginning, the docks here have determined the fortunes of this city. They've also allowed local criminals to play a part on the global stage.
The most infamous was Curtis Warren, known as Cocky, a leading figure in the Liverpool mafia and an international drug smuggling ring that controlled Britain's £2 billion a year cocaine business. The only known criminal to make it onto the Times rich list. But Liverpool gangs haven't always been such high rollers.
In the 19th century, the stakes were much smaller. An innocent man was kicked to death for just a few pence. It was a crime so violent it caused public outrage and became a landmark in the war against gangs in Liverpool.
We'll be looking at two very different gang crimes. One for sixpence, another for £40 million.
I'm looking at a contemporary report on gangs from a Liverpool newspaper of 1874, and it says, they were given up to every form of misconduct, morally and socially. They preyed upon society and degraded the very instincts of society. They were the cornermen. I've come to Liverpool to find out more about the cornermen who plagued this city over 100 years ago.
No wonder they used to call Liverpool the Venice of the North, so imposing. And all that grandeur and wealth came from the docks.
In the 19th century, the docks covered 140 acres with 10 miles of quay space. It was, effectively, a doorway to the world. To find out more about the city, I've come to meet local historian John Archer. What was Liverpool like in 1874?
Well, Liverpool was perhaps the leading port in the world, and so everything was based around the docks. So there were perhaps 20,000 ships coming in and out in a year. Tens of thousands of Irish people migrated here during the Irish famine, the Great Hunger, at the end of the 1840s. So you get a very large Irish population, on top of a Welsh, Scottish. It was a very cosmopolitan place, Liverpool, in the 1870s.
Liverpool underwent a massive population explosion. Immigrants of every nationality flooded into the city. In just a few years, the population grew almost tenfold, reaching 530,000 by 1870.
And what was employment like?
There were too many people, in a sense. So most people perhaps could get 3 or 4 days' work a week on the docks. A lot of young lads initially were employed as nippers, and they're young men that sat on carts, but then they'd be made unemployed at 16 because the younger nippers available, and there aren't a lot of jobs in a place like Liverpool. Yet the rich lived cheek by jowl almost with the poor, because in the centre of Liverpool you had St George's Hall and sort of large libraries, and they're right slap bang next to the slums.
This was where two worlds collided. The prosperity of one of the world's greatest seaports came face to face with some of the most appalling slums in Europe.
This is Tybarn Street. That way, it goes down to the Mersey and the docks and opens up to the sea with all its promise of opportunity and adventure. But in the late 1800s, if you walk that way, you'd walk into a maze of slums. The Victorian pedestrian, within 5 minutes, could go from hope to despair.
What must it have been like to live in that murky underground world? A place made up of petty criminals and thugs who would turn to violence as a first resort. To help me explore this part of Liverpool's past, I've enlisted the help of historian Michael McIlwee.
So who were the cornermen? They weren't really a gang, were they?
No, they're just groups of young men that just hang around the street corners because they just haven't got enough money to go in the pub and buy beer. So they'd spit and swear and occasionally push people off the pavement and
just guys who couldn't afford to be in the pub?
Yeah. Most of these people would have been working on the docks, although it's casual labour, so they're in one day, not working the next. So the rich one day, poor the next.
We're standing outside a pub. There would have been another pub there. There's one over there. How many pubs were there in this area?
Well, Liverpool was famous for its pubs. A newspaper estimated that if you put every drinking establishment in Liverpool in a straight line, they'd reach 11.5 miles. So everything revolves around the pub, you know, the instantaneous pleasure of alcohol.
But the hobnail boots were quite a famous part of their dress.
There were quite a few kicking incidents in the whole of Lancashire, because that was the weapon, along with your leather belt. I mean, everyone wore a leather belt to keep the trousers up. So in a fight, that would be the first thing to come off. And of course, you've got a big steel buckle there. You hit someone in the face with a buckle, it's similar to a knife wound, a slash.
But this is where public houses are really living up to their name, because your own house is not a nice place.
The houses were so cold and dank anyway that you may as well be out on the street corners with your friends, begging for money to try and get a drink, you know, if you haven't got enough money yourself.
Since the late 19th century, Liverpool has been plagued by gangs.
Gangs with names attached to them, gang fights, become more evident in the 1880s in Liverpool. But you do get more of a gang culture, or a feeling for gang culture, in the 1880s.
In this part of town, the fearsome cornermen claimed rule over the streets.
This is a map of the city back then. And this is Tybarn Street, running along here to the docks, with their huge berths all full of container ships. And up here, this is where our cornermen would have hung out, wearing their trademark boots, their soles covered in deadly nails. The beatings they would hand out saw their notoriety soar, and they soon became known as a menace not to be messed with. So they were violent, usually drunk and fairly disorganised.
The opposite of the guy I'm looking into. Curtis Warren, born 1963. Unlike the cornerman Gary's looking at, this guy is full on. He operates on a much bigger scale. A drug baron in the Liverpool mafia whose efforts made heroin and cocaine available to both rich and poor in every town in the UK. He rose from the street to make it onto not only the Times Rich list, but also onto the top of Interpol's list
of most wanted men. Curtis Warren was the second son of a mixed-race seaman from South America who lived with his Spanish wife. Regarded as half-caste, he fell into neither the white nor the black gangs of the city and had to prove himself all the more. He grew up in the Granby area of Toxteth. There were alehouses, clubs, prostitutes and strip joints. Old West Indians in Panama hats smoked ganja. Women in saris ran stores. Hindus, Muslims, Rastafarians and Christians all mixed together. I'm here to meet journalist Graham Johnson, author of The Cartel and Powder Wars, who can tell me a bit more about Curtis Warren.
So this is Toxteth, where Curtis grew up.
Yeah.
What was it like during those years?
The drugs cartel started here 30 years ago, and this is where people like Curtis Warren and other cartel godfathers came from.
What, these streets?
Yeah, just around here, yeah. Now, there are parts of Toxteth which are very gentrified, and lots of money has been poured into it. But then, it was poverty-stricken. It was one of the most deprived parts of Europe. So you had a lot of connections to the docks. But listen, they all closed down in the early 80s. Loads of jobs went, 25–30% unemployment around here.
So it all kind of accumulated into the riots.
Yeah.
Did that change everything?
Yeah, it changed everything. It changed the criminal landscape. The riots were really an uprising. They were caused by deprivation and kind of racist, heavy-handed policing. And this was effectively turned into a no-go area. The police didn't want to come in here because it was difficult for them to mount patrols, and there were lots of tension between the police and the local population. You had a lot of kind of alienated people who couldn't find work. And it was like a pool of unemployed foot soldiers who thought, well, if we can't work in the legitimate economy, we'll work for the local drug dealers. It was kind of spun as a kind of, if you're doing this, it's a political act as well as a criminal act. It's kind of a rebellion against mainstream society.
Aged 9, Curtis Warren would climb through small windows and burgle homes. By 11, he dropped out of school and was carrying out muggings and armed robberies. At 12, he was stealing cars. As a teenager, he progressed to selling heroin.
Well, Curtis Warren growing up around here, he must have just... I can understand where he's coming from, to be honest, because he must have just wanted to better himself. And you can understand why I think that kids that are living in these areas turn to crime. I mean, why not? I mean, some of these places that you're looking at, people live better in prison.
I want to find out why Liverpool became a different city after the 80s riots and how they transformed the city's underworld.
Let's start at the beginning. How did the Liverpool Mafia come about?
After the war, crime in this city was based around commercial burglaries. It was based around smuggling contraband through the docks. So the crime gangs, both black and white, were pretty good and pretty experienced at getting, you know, stuff through the stolen gear through the docks, getting it out and distributing it. They had a good import network, but what they needed was a good distribution network on the ground.
Yeah.
So after the riots, there was a very kind of convenient alliance was made between these white middle-aged criminals, these former armed robbers, and young black criminals from Toxteth.
This alliance coincided with a massive influx of hard drugs into Britain. Heroin and cocaine. Sean Smith has been a bouncer working on the doors of many of Liverpool's clubs. He noticed a dramatic change in the city when the white and black gangs first started operating together.
I've worked on the door since I was 16 years of age. Started getting good at my job, stopping people coming in clubs, being good with the licensees, managers, manageresses. People see you, people like you. Next minute, before I knew it, I was looking after pubs, shops, nightclubs, picking money up, dropping off to the bank for them. From when I started on the doors, it was years ago, people could end things on a handshake or, you know, I'll meet you tomorrow, let's have a straight in there, a phone call. When all the drugs hit the city in late 80s, early 90s, it basically just changed everything. Most of the trouble I had was from not letting grafters, drug dealers in the club. They'd come in the club, they'd speak to you. Can we give a lad, give him 1,000 tablets to sell in the club every night it's open? No. Come on and we'll give you a percentage. No. Because I had that many doors in the city, and they got knocked back from that many doors in the city, you didn't like it. So we started getting problems. These people would leave the club. Your doorman would leave, they'd follow one or two your doorman home. They'd be getting it over the head with bats, or the car blew up. Then it'd be going, you own the company, we're going to come and get you. We work for, he's a big name in the drugs, we work for him, he's a big name in the drugs. We've got the money backed up by him. We'll burn your house, we'll torch your cars, we'll cough for all your doorman, we'll cough for your bird, and then we'll cough for you. And the drug culture and the impact they had on the city just changed everything. I was shot at umpteen times. It's documented, it's been in the papers. I've had my house blew up, I've had cars blew up. I've had my young daughter attacked. I've had my wife attacked. I've had a threat of warning. Someone tried to shoot me in my house. But it's just a thing I didn't abide by. You know, if people want to take drugs, and that's their choice, it's not my choice. But at the end of the day, I've seen what it does to people. It wrecks people's lives.
I want to find out how Curtis Warren, a street-level dealer, became such a big shot.
Tell me about Curtis Warren. Yeah. Right. So he starts off in Toxteth as this kind of small-time drug dealer, and ends up practically sitting on top of the pile with the Liverpool mafia. How does he do that?
Well, he started off as a burglar, and then he got involved with a travelling network. These were kind of unique to this city. These were networks which would go out across the country to commit crime. Scotland, Cornwall, London, the South Coast. And they'd be doing burglaries and selling drugs and whatever. And he got involved with one of them. And he got involved with one which went to Europe. And that was partly down to the football. Liverpool were doing well in the early 80s. So you got lots of fans who were going abroad. And then they were getting nicked in places like Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Germany. They were going in jail. They were making contacts within the jail. And then they started to build up a little drugs network.
Is that how he started to travel through Europe because of football?
When I was growing up, there were lads in school who would get off school and go and do this. And he was involved in that. And then what he got involved in was robbing tills and doing jeweller shops abroad. So he was kind of apprenticeship in how to do business abroad.
Warren had several advantages over his rivals. He was brighter, smarter, began to spread his net out wider. After a 5-year prison stretch for armed robbery, he came out, made several trips to Europe. It wouldn't be long before Warren had built Britain's biggest ever drug importation business.
We're looking at the gangs of Liverpool, old and new. And over 100 years ago, the cornermen menaced the streets of the city. One of their attacks was particularly shocking and targeted an innocent young couple. It was Bank Holiday Monday, August the 3rd, 1874, and Richard Morgan and his wife Alice were on their way back across the river after a day trip to Birkenhead. It was around 9 p.m. when they got off the ferry and they met Richard's older brother Samuel. They walked up Tithe Barn Street and on their way home popped into a pub in Chapel Street for a final drink. They were ordinary people on an innocent night out. The events that were about to happen would not just shock this city, they would become a landmark tragedy in the history of gangs. Even though he lived in a poor district, Richard was a respectable shop worker, a married man in regular employment, something to be proud of in a city like Liverpool. So early that evening, Richard Morgan, his wife Alice and his brother Samuel had come off the ferry and were coming back up Tithe Barn Street and popped into a pub, probably this one, for a quick drink. Coming out, they were surrounded by some cornermen, and one asked Richard if he had sixpence for a quart pint. Richard said, "Have you got a job?" And at that point, one of the boys said, "Yeah, we got a job. We knock down people like you and get their money off them. That's our job." His wife Alice said, "Let's go, come on, come away." And as Richard turned, a blow was landed behind his ear and he fell to the ground, never to get up again. His brother Samuel retaliated at once, knocking the assailant down. One of the gang whistled for backup. a third man started kicking Richard and then fell on top of him and choked him for what seemed like 2 minutes. Alice, his wife, jumped on him to try and protect him, and someone took a running kick at her. She then came up and was hit in the ear and remained deaf forever after. His brother Samuel was lashing out at others who were trying to attack him. Crowds poured out of these pubs, and instead of protecting Richard and his family, they egged on the perpetrators. And one woman was heard shouting, "Give him it! Give him it!" Richard was being hit and kicked. Someone took off their belt and scrutched him. But by this time, Morgan was dead. Then the perpetrators got up and ran down one of these side streets here. Samuel ran after them, but a knife came out. He was then attacked from behind and dragged away. Finally, they said, up to 7 men kicked Richard Morgan across the width of Tide Barn Road, a distance of about 40 feet, like a football.
On returning, Samuel found his brother's mud-spattered body had been placed on the steps of the warehouse. Someone was trying to give him brandy, but he was unable to drink it. Eventually, at 9:50 p.m, PC Adam Green arrived. He helped to take Richard's body to the North Dispensary in Vauxhall Road. The coroner found Richard's body shockingly cut and bruised. What appears to be a stab wound is identified on the left side of his neck. On his right thigh are 2 similar wounds.
So I think what sort of riled these cornermen was probably Richard saying, "Where do you work?"
Yeah.
The implication was that these guys didn't want to work and that he did.
Yeah.
And so there was a kind of class faction already between them. Even, in a way, Richard was, although he was living in the slums, I guess he was perceived as middle class.
Richard was more respectable because he held down a job in a shop. He'd not long been married, and a lot was made of that in the press, the fact that this respectable man was being beaten up by these work-shy scroungers, ruffians. This was at 9:30 in the night. It was a summer evening, so it was still light. And of course, this is one of the major streets in Liverpool, one of the original 7 streets. This wasn't some rough back alley hidden away from the patrol and policemen. There were lots of witnesses to the crime, and yet nobody intervened. And not only did they not intervene, but some of them, including women, actually shouted encouragement to the attackers, such as "give it to him, give it to him." And in fact, some of the men then joined in the kicking. And that was so shocking at the time.